Okay. All right. This is Michael Mikowski. Welcome. I'm the President and CEO of JINSA. I'm honored to have my colleague, retired U.S. General Frank McKenzie with me. He is the he's JINSA's Hertog Distinguished Fellow, and he, among many other positions in his very long and distinguished career in the U.S. military. His last position was as commander of the U.S. Central Command, our Mideast Command. It's obviously very active right now, and that area has been extremely in the news. We plan to talk about that a little bit, maybe at the end. But the occasion for today's webinar is to discuss with General McKenzie the release of a paper he did for JINSA, which I think is really important, which is very important. I think will have an important impact on policymakers. And it is basically, let me see for the exact title. I apologize, but it is, let me get the exact title. I apologize one second. But it's basically overcoming the tyranny of geography, and it is a reimagining of U.S. of the basing of U.S. forces in the Middle East. So we released it. You should see it, I think, as part of this invitation, but we released it about a week ago. It is on our website at jinsa.org. If you haven't read it yet, I strongly encourage you to read it. It is actually, it's as everything General McKenzie writes, it's extremely well written and to the point, and it's very accessible. All right, let's get right to it. General, it's good to see you. Thank you. So tell me, what I think it's a very interesting paper, and I think it's something that folks in Washington in particular need to read, because I think there's a lot of old thinking about U.S. force, about the basing of U.S. force in the Middle East. Maybe I'll just start you off with a basic question. The current structure of U.S. bases in the region, how did they come about being where they are? Exactly.
Mike, first of all, always great to join you. I applaud the work that JINSA does. I'm certainly happy to be part of it. So really, U.S. bases in the region, and particularly U.S. bases along the southern edge of the Arabian Gulf, are an artifact going back many, many decades. In fact, they really, to begin, they were placed there to have ways to defend against a Soviet push north to the oil fields through Iran, when Iran was still an ally before the fall of the Shah in the 1970s. So really, you look at the beginning of U.S. bases in the region, it dates from that period of time. And there was great debate over those bases then. A couple of different schools of thought in the Carter administration about would the bases actually, be a symbol for people to rally against the United States? Would be more effective being offshore, less visible in the region? We chose to be visible in the region. That's had both good and bad effect. But over time, what we've seen, Mike, is the bases have been built up and they've been used to prosecute, first of all, the defense of Saudi Arabia and the reestablishment of sovereignty in Kuwait in the early 1990s. And then, of course, to support our operations against Iraq in the early 2000s and our operations in Afghanistan over the 2-decade war that we fought there. These bases are all artifacts of that particular period. So what has changed over this long continuum of time in the region has been the growth of Iran as the principal malign actor in the region. And the bases were not where you'd put them if you plan to fight Iran, or really not fight Iran, but to deter Iran, which means being able to fight, visibly being able to fight Iran. So we find ourselves now where we have a very dangerous actor in the region, and that dangerous actor is Iran. And we have a basing structure that has both some advantages. It's very close to Iran, so you don't have to drive very far to fight. On the other hand, the disadvantage of being in the area is the Iranians over the last 20 years have invested a remarkable amount of money in building out their cruise missile, their drone, and their theater ballistic missile force. Some of those are long range. Many of them are short range. Many more are short range. And typically our bases, particularly those bases in Qatar and UAE and Bahrain, all fall underneath that short range umbrella. And that should concern us. So we need some new thinking here. And we began to do that when I was the commander of Central Command. It needs to continue. And that's really what the paper was about. The fact that bases were built for a reason. You need to constantly examine your basing structure, your force posture to react to the most imminent threat. Not much chance of the Russians coming down now to seize the oil fields. We're out of a war in Afghanistan, and our operations in Iraq and in Syria are actually fairly minor operations. So it's a good time to sort of think about how do we want to envision basing in the future against the most likely and the most dangerous threat, which is that threat that I just described from the Islamic Republic.
Okay, that's important. Let me ask you then, so given that the threat now is Iran, and we have to have a credible deterrence, as you point out, and it's not the Soviets so much. So if we could talk about a few countries. So we have bases, for instance, in Kuwait. We have one in the El Udeid one might be one of the most well-known ones in Qatar. So are they then more vulnerable given their proximity to Iran of getting, in a conflict?
Mike, absolutely. Let's just take Al Udeid as an example. Al Udeid has the CENTCOM forward headquarters. It's located there. I spent many, many, many days at that forward headquarters. Until fairly recently, the whole of our combined air operations center was located there. We have, over the last couple of years, undertaken some actions to disperse that because we have global communications. We don't actually have to be right there in order to run the air war in the theater if it's necessary. So we've done some dispersal of that. But here's the problem. The base is 3 to 5 minutes away from a ballistic missile attack from Iran. That's very close. And they have lots and lots of missiles they can put against that base. So again, we go back to the point, it's a very well constructed base. The Qatar spent a lot of money on the base, but just from a military point of view, it has the advantages of assuring our friends in the region that we're with them because they can't leave. They're stuck there. But it has the disadvantage of being very vulnerable to Iranian attack. And given the mass and number of Iranian weapons, the possibility of overmatch against our systems, such as Patriot and other systems that would defend the base against that type of attack, is just very, very close. So the probability of that base surviving in a major exchange with Iran, I would argue, is pretty low. It's going to be very difficult to base out of there. Now, at different times, we have based everything from bombers to fighters to tankers to reconnaissance aircraft, both manned and unmanned from that base. And again, close is good, but there are ways to overcome that negative geography, and that's sort of the back half of the paper talking about that. Many of these the same logic also applies to bases in UAE, to bases in Kuwait, as you discussed, and also bases in Bahrain. They all have these similar vulnerabilities. Al Udeid is probably the closest, so it's the most clearly visible of these potential risks. But nonetheless, all these bases share to varying degrees this increased risk from Iran based on increasing Iranian capabilities that have been developed very carefully over the last few years. So we need to think about ways where we can take advantage of other areas in the theater where we might be able to base, not necessarily coming off these bases, but if you're going to fight Iran, you need to demonstrate you can be survivable against them in a high-end fight.
Just out of curiosity, of those bases, those countries you mentioned Bahrain, which obviously is our Fifth Fleet is based there, right? So would that be a base, for instance, that because our fleet is based there, that we should keep there in your view, or does that also need to be a base that
Well,
might be?
actually, Mike, in the way the Department of Defense looks at bases in the Central Command region, the way that the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy stacks these bases, the main operating base for Central Command in the region is actually the naval base at Manama, Bahrain. That's the main operating base, not Al Udeid Air Base, which is a very important air base. But Manama, Bahrain is really the main operating base for Central Command in the region. So having Fifth Fleet there sends a lot of signals. It allows us to do outreach with our neighbors. It's a great headquarters for operating inside the Arabian Gulf and in the northern Gulf of Oman. So there's a lot of good, when you're campaigning short of war, there's a lot of good reason to be there. Here's the problem. If you're campaigning in war, it's a bad place to be because you can be easily overwhelmed by the enemy. Now, look, ships are different than airplanes. Airplanes are easier to move. Ships
Yeah.
are harder to move. Ships are harder to repair. So you would have to look long and hard about going to a different base for your Fifth Fleet. We do have those plans. We always have these kinds of plans. Airplanes are just a little bit easier to look at,
Yeah.
Mike.
So let me ask you about before 1 second before we ask you where you think we should be posturing our forces more. So your argument in your paper is not eliminating our bases here, but reducing our assets in these bases. Is that right?
That's correct, Mike. We need to have a plan. We need to have a plan if indications and warning arrive of probability of likelihood of Iran doing something stupid. You want to be able to visibly message Iran that we can do things to make your attack less successful. And that means while you might want to operate from these bases at near capacity in peacetime, as tensions rise, you want to be able to flow to other bases. And those typically would be bases in the western part of the theater. In Saudi Arabia, bases up and down the Red Sea coast, maybe some further away in Oman, perhaps some further away in Jordan, and you might even consider Egypt as well. And of course, now with the entry of Israel into the region, we have the possibility of considering basing in Israel as well. We were just beginning to look at that when I left Central Command. I have no idea where that thinking is right now, but of course you'd want to look at that because it's one of the best protected areas in the region. So there's a lot of advantages that accrue from Israel, but there are also advantages that accrue from going into Western Saudi Arabia. And in short, Mike, here's what it is. The Iranians have far fewer weapons that can fire west of Riyadh, that can get all the way out to Jeddah and places in Western Saudi Arabia. So you reduce the volley count from Iran, number one. Number two, they got to find those bases and target them. Their targeting is not perfect. It's pretty good against bases like Al Udeid and even Prince Sultan Air Base because they're much closer. But you get out to the west, they have a targeting problem. You can play a little bit of shell game with them. And all those things accrue to your advantage if you go out there and base. Now, look, I'm not saying those bases exist now ready to receive U.S. aircraft. Saudi Arabia has done some things to assist us. This would be something we'd want the Saudis to do because ultimately, of course, it helps them. They're improving their bases. These would be joint co-use combined bases. Saudi aircraft would fly from there. U.S. aircraft would fly from there. So it's very much in sought to Saudis' long and short-term benefit to consider additions to this basing structure. In the event of conflict, you go west, you complicate the Iranian targeting problem. You base to the west, you fly in, you conduct your operations either over the Strait of Hormuz and the Arabian Gulf or possibly over Iran in a high-end conflict. You come back, you might bounce. You might bounce at one of the forward bases, Al Udeid, Al Dhafra, rearm, go back up, fight, then come home. And the key to this, obviously, Mike, is the unique thing that makes American strategic air power possible, and that's our tanker force. The KC-135 tanker, it's an old but very capable air platform. The KC-46 is coming in. Those are the things that make it possible for you to base further away and commute to work, if you will. We can do that. It's harder for the Iranians to do it. So we should take advantage of technological capabilities that exist and really the structure of nations in the region that share our same view of Iran, which in turn gives us a significant advantage over Iran when we get into a fight. Iran has none of those advantages. They have no ability to refuel in the air. They don't have, first of all, they don't have airplanes that can really reach that far. And their targeting problem for their missiles would increase because they won't know exactly where you are. So there are all kinds of reasons why this is something that would help us a lot.
Also, let me mention you referred to Israel's entry to the region. So just to clarify, what you're referring to is Israel's entry in CENTCOM's area of responsibility, right? So there's
Right,
that.
absolutely.
I guess some of the changes that I assume, but I like to address that led you to start thinking about this when you were CENTCOM commander is you have Israel. President Trump approved Israel being part of CENTCOM's air responsibility in January 2021. It was the U.S. European Command. Then you had a few months before that, there was the Abraham Accords. Now there's also been conversation if there is to be normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and I think it's still very possible. Then as part of that, it's understood there would be a U.S.-Israel excuse me, a U.S.-Saudi mutual defense treaty. And I wonder also, so I wonder how that, I guess that also leads you to think there are all these changes going on the ground, and maybe the basing needs to reflect that as well.
Well, I think so. I mean, I view the entry of Israel into the Central Command area of responsibility is the operationalization of the Abraham Accords.
Yeah.
It really puts security meat on that bone, and what it does is it also gives the CENTCOM commander the convening authority to bring chiefs of defense from the region together. And I did that a couple of times before I left command, and my successor Eric Kurilla has done that brilliantly following. He's done a very good job of taking this to a new height of cooperation, which allow these defense leaders to talk about common problems. And I think we saw that manifested in the success of the defense of Israel in 13 April. I think that was directly a result of the Abraham Accords, directly the result of the movement of Israel into the Central Command AOR, and the continued development of a common picture, if you will, of how you defend against the principal threat these nations see, which is Iranian drones, missiles, and ballistic missiles.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Just remind our audience as we have JINSA was always since 2018. We pushed for Israel to be for the transfer of Israel to CENTCOM's air responsibility. I think we're the only organization in Washington that did so. I let me ask you about Israel about that with the basing. And you made a reference, it's a very secure area. Obviously, we'll talk about it in a few minutes, but obviously the Israeli Air Force, I think arguably could be stated as the most capable in the region, with a tremendous reach. I mean, they hit Yemen again, as well as hitting deep into Lebanon and elsewhere. Um, how do you think that could figure in? Wouldn't that be a natural in a way for US? We already have, for instance, with Warsaw, we already have an arms depot already in the country, right?
So I think, yes, all of those things are true, Michael, but also I think what's very important is the way Israel's neighbors in the region see this as an opportunity.
Mhm.
They understand the technological ability that Israel brings. They see what it can do to help them defend against this very imminent Iranian threat. And so for all those reasons, just pragmatically at the military level, there's great interest in this and further developing these ties. Look, I'm not going to say it's going to be a smooth road. I'm not going to say it's not going to be delayed by other factors. I am saying, however, in my judgment, this is inevitable and it's going to happen. It's just a question of time.
You thought you were referring to the using a base in Israel, or you're referring to, yeah?
I'm talking about normalization, further normalization
Oh,
of
yeah, yeah.
Israel, its Arab neighbors, which of course also directly contributes to our development of plans to base in Israel in the event of a war with Iran. Although I need to say, Mike, I have no knowledge of that, so I really don't know the answer to that. I would just think that's something CENTCOM is probably considering as they look at Western Saudi Arabia, as they look at Oman, as they look at Egypt, as they look at other basing alternatives. You certainly got to consider Israel.
Yeah. Oh, I'll just add, and this is something that JINSA is also we've pushed since 2018, but a little more intensely in recent years, which is a U.S. Israel mutual defense treaty. It was on the table. The two countries were speaking about it last year before October 7th at a very senior level. We'll see whether they resume those kind of conversations. Whether that would seem, if there is such a treaty, and if you had a treaty like this in Saudi, a U.S. Saudi treaty, that would seem to me to even make more of a case for uh, basing U.S. forces or planes more in Israel. Um,
Certainly, Michael, absolutely.
all right, so look, I actually do want to ask you, since we're holding this conversation in a very momentous time in the region, I do want to talk to you what's going on, but before we do that, are there any other comments about your paper that you think it's important that people understand? Yeah.
Mike, I think we've drawn out most of the key points. I just think this is a great opportunity to examine this basing structure. Uh, it's time for, and I think there's broad military level agreement about this across the region. Of course, these decisions are ultimately not military decisions; they're political decisions. And so we now need to look at the political level to continue the momentum that we've got along this line of thinking.
I'm glad you brought up. Let me just ask you a follow-up on that. So let's say the U.S. military, they decide your successor, General Kurilla, the Joint Chiefs, they said, you know what, General McKenzie is right. We need to reimagine. We got to try to set up a base in Western Saudi Arabia. We want to see about Israel or Jordan and so on. So then what happens next? Does there have to be any, is there a decision, is there some formal decision, the Pentagon, and then it goes to the diplomats and start working out with these countries? How does that play out in practice, I guess?
So that would actually be a policy level decision within the Pentagon that would involve coordination with state, probably ultimately an interagency process. Something this significant is going to have all different elements of the U.S. government. They're going to be very interested in it because of the signals it's going to send, because of the potential cost. And we would not want to bear much of that cost. We would hope that our friends in the region would bear that cost because we're talking about defending them. But
Yeah.
nonetheless, those things would involve a lot more than a military decision. That's a level really above the combatant commander. OSD policy, state, interagency, the National Security Council staff, all those entities are going to be very interested in this going forward.
So let me ask you on that though, like you discussed this in your book, which we recently had a webinar about, your recently released book about even the creation of CENTCOM, that created, bureaucratic static, there's bureaucratic opposition. Where would you see any opposition bureaucratically against what you're proposing in this paper? Within the US government, I'm referring to.
Sure. I go back to sometimes you read a very close reading of the National Defense Strategy, which says we're leading the region.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
we shouldn't emphasize it. So I think that's an overly didactic approach to the problem, but that was what I saw my time in command at CENTCOM. We don't want to do this because we want to we really kind of, it's an idea, you want the problem to go away. You don't want to face the reality of the problem, and that leads you often to make decisions that come back and haunt you in the long run, as we have seen.
okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. I commend you. I think it's an excellent paper, and I'm expecting and hope that it will get a lot of attention here in Washington, particularly after the election. So let me ask you, in the few minutes left, we're going to end it in no later than 11:30 Eastern time. So it's obviously rarely boring in the Middle East, but it's become particularly interesting in the last couple of weeks with Israeli strikes. I mean, obviously the elimination of Nasrallah in Lebanon, basically the whole Hezbollah command structure, it seems, has been eliminated. The Israeli Air Force is just also destroying a lot of launchers and missiles and rockets, and even went so far to hit back at the in Yemen at the Houthis for sending some missiles in central Israel. I guess, how do you see this going on, and what do you make? If I may start with the last one, if I may, on the Israeli attack on this port in Yemen that hit, I think oil storage facilities, I think utilities, the port area that I think intakes oil or weapons, excuse me, from Iran. It seems to me the Israelis have almost done more in their two strikes in Yemen that we've seen in recent months than the U.S. military has in a long time.
Well, Mike, I don't have the details of U.S. strikes, but they do appear to be highly circumscribed, very tightly controlled. And that's not the way you're going to have effects on the Houthis. They know and understand the use of power, and they will respect it when aggressive force is used against them, and they'll hold in contempt those who choose not to do so. So we're in a bad place down there right now. I don't know. I don't know what our way forward is. We have the capability to make the Houthis open the Strait of Hormuz. I'm sorry, the Bab el-Mandeb. We have the capability to prevent the Houthis from closing the Bab el-Mandeb. We do not have the political will, in my judgment, necessary to apply that military force, and that's what's going to be required. The Israelis, I don't think, have that problem. And they have come down and struck hard down there because the Houthis are the true believers in all this big equation, what's going on in the region. They have been very aggressive and active in their support of Hamas, very vocal about it. And so, they've tried to strike Israel. The problem is it's hard to strike Israel from Yemen. Range is a factor. There are a lot of things that militate against being effective in that kind of attack. But what you can be effective in doing, if you're the Houthis, is, of course, you can close the Bab el-Mandeb, which they have done. And except for Chinese flag ships, it's very hard to go through the Bab el-Mandeb right now.
Yeah. All right. And they hit, I think you destroyed an oil terminal, I should say, the Ras Isa. Let me ask you about what you see in Israel, what they've been doing, Lebanon. So far, the Iranians have not really retaliated yet. In fact, it was reported before the killing of Nasrallah that the Hezbollah actually were begging Iran to get involved, and the Iranians basically said, "Not now." The president of Iran, I think, when he was in New York for UN Week, said last week, "We're not going to fall into that Israeli trap." Clearly showing that they didn't want to do anything. Now, they might be forced to do something now, but have you at least been impressed, or what has been? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what's been your reaction to what Israel's been doing to Hezbollah, and has it been surprising to you how effective it's been?
So what's been surprising to me has been, first of all, Iran's lack of response. That's of all the things, that's the most surprising. But as you look at it, not really. And here's why. The first goal of Iranian foreign policy is protection of the theocratic regime. Number one priority. Number two and number three, destruction of Israel, ejection of the United States from the region. But two and three are never going to threaten paramount number one. Iran attacked Israel in a major way on the 13th of April. That attack was a failure. And that was the best they had. People who think, well, they were just signaling, it was designed to be a show of force. No, it was not. It was designed to have great effect against Israel. It failed. And that was the ballistic missiles we've been talking about. Iran has a throughput problem. They can only launch so many missiles in a salvo that'll get to Israel in a given time. Hard to overwhelm Israeli air defenses with that, particularly when they're assisted by the United States and the neighbors in the region are assisting Israel as well. So who could do it, we thought, was Lebanese Hezbollah. But what Israel has done over the last 3 weeks or so is they have systematically removed the command and control echelon of Lebanese Hezbollah. It doesn't exist anymore. I think it's very difficult for Lebanese Hezbollah to coordinate a major strike into Israel right now. What do I mean by that? I mean hundreds of missiles in an hour into downtown Tel Aviv. Hard for them to do. That was always my great fear, that what Lebanese Hezbollah would be able to do. Now, the Israelis would be able to intercept most of those missiles, maybe not all of them, but the vast majority of them. But still, it would pose a very great test for the Israeli defensive system, particularly their air defense system. So what the Israelis have done is they've knocked out the command and control echelon, and I believe they are systematically now going after missiles wherever they're buried, typically in people's houses, unfortunately, tragically, hospitals, houses, mosques, places where the law of war specifically prohibits the placement of weapons of this nature, but that's where Hezbollah has chosen to put them. So here's the thing to look at, though, Mike. If you're from a pragmatic point of view, over the next 96 hours, do the missile attacks stop into northern Israel? And are they able to consider getting people back? Because that's really what you got to have here. And so it will be interesting to see. Now, we wouldn't expect that to begin immediately because I'm not sure who's giving orders in Hezbollah anymore. And I'm not sure that anybody's anxious to be the person giving those orders anymore. So it may take Hezbollah a little while to determine what their course of action is. But I think for Israel, they've got to be able to return these people to their homes in northern Israel. That is absolutely the basis for everything that's happened up until this point. So that's the key. That's the metric I'd look at. Have the Israelis had success here? Clearly, they've had remarkable success in dismantling LH in a way that I don't think anybody thought they could do. But there is a metric, and we need to pay attention to that metric. Are Israeli citizens able to go back to their kibbutzes, the towns and villages in the north of the country?
One last question, and then I guess we have to end it. Do you think, I guess one of the questions at the very moment is, does Israel need to use ground? Will they bring in ground forces? Now, I admit, I always thought they needed to do that a lot. It seems like the Air Force has been, as you point out, much more effective, I guess, than I thought in destroying so much without ground forces. I guess particularly in that southern area of Lebanon, south of Litani, I guess the question is, does Israel need to introduce, even for a limited campaign, ground forces? I know you're a former Marine. I'd be curious what you think on that.
They should be very careful about doing that. You don't want to get bogged down into another bloody fight up there, even south of the Litani River. I would, if I were the IDF, I'd look and see what's Hezbollah doing. If they're continuing the missile strikes, you may have to go up there. I agree with you. The Air Force has had remarkable success, but ultimately, if you're going to remove something like this, it's just a tragic fact of life. You got to put people on the ground to do it. and that's a very ugly, messy form of warfare. And Israel's been up there before, and it had and suffered significant casualties up there. Did a lot of damage to Hezbollah too. I think they will think long and hard about it. I think they'll prefer to go with special operations raids as long as they can, but they may not be able to do that forever. Again, I come back to something I've emphasized several times. Are the attacks stopping in northern Israel? That's really the metric we need to look at.
All right. On that note, I want to thank you, General, for joining us this morning. I want to commend you on your very extremely thought-provoking and practical paper. I hope it gets a lot of play here in Washington and among policymakers, because I think it's important, as you point out, the old structure is an anachronism. The current structure is an anachronism, and it's important to address the current threat. So, all right. Well, thank you very much, General.
Thanks, Mike. Take care.
All right,
Bye-bye.
take care. Thanks for the conversation. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today.